going down the road feeling bad. I'm going down the road feeling bad. Going down the road feeling bad, and I ain't going to be treated this way.
Okay, hello and welcome to the podcast of slavery by us.
By us. Who are we?
Who are we? That's
I'm
Ding Chen,
I'm Ludwig.
Ben.
Ole.
Jesse.
Batu.
Okay, so now that we've introduced ourselves, we're going to introduce the topic. It's sort of a history of slavery in specifically about the transatlantic slave trade. And we'll start off with the first question. When and why did the transatlantic slave trade begin? Ding Chen, could you?
Yeah. So the transatlantic slave trade is started from 16th century, I think. It all started. Yeah. Well, yeah. It all started with the Portuguese. They basically kidnapped some Africans and they brought them to Europe. And when they discovered America, they just took them with them. And for some people, the real starting point of the transatlantic slave trade is around the beginning of the 17th century, when the British people they basically just bought the people from west coast of Africa.
Yeah.
And
Because I believe that the Dutch people only did like 5% of the slaves, like only 600,000 in total or something like that.
Only 600,000.
Yeah, but there were
I mean,
millions.
that's nothing compared to the British with 25%.
actually, the British people they didn't do the most. I think the Portuguese they brought.
Yeah, it
probably.
was.
But yeah, it was in like, what was the year? Like 1538. Some Spanish kings made a deal with two South Netherlands merchants, and they were given the order, signed a contract to deliver 4,000 slaves over the next 4 years. But initially, the Dutch people were against slavery because of their Christian values, and in the Bible they read that it's not good to have slaves. And later on, they used the Bible as an excuse to keep slaves.
Yeah,
Quite ironic, actually.
Saying that all the descendants of Ham was that Cain's brother?
Yeah, that was that was
One of
the
the-
son of one of the sons of Noah who sort of slept with Noah when he was drunk, and he ended up getting cursed, and that's how they sort of talked that one out.
Yeah. So basically, they just said all the descendants of Ham are born to be slaves because apparently slavery is genetic.
But what made him
obviously.
switch sides?
Money,
Well,
probably.
in 1920, no, not 1920, 1621, the WIC, the West Indies Compagnie, was given authority to govern over some colonies in West Africa, and they were militarily governing them, and what's the word when they govern
Money.
the trade? Yeah,
Money is
and
the
they were
word.
governing the trade as well. And in
monopoly.
1630 is when the WIC started trading slaves, because before that they only traded sugar, tobacco, and gold.
So it's like we saw a new opportunity to
pretty
gain
much.
more profits.
But also a thing with the slave trade, I think they all started because when they are exploring the America, the continent, they find that it's really good for farm to get some tobacco and coffee beans
Yeah.
Yeah,
and cotton.
makes sense.
So initially I think they did it with the native people, but suddenly they die from the disease and that carried by the European people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
So
Which killed
actually,
them
the Dutch allowed themselves to do slavery because they switched sides on the Bible.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, basically, they looked at it one day and said, you know what?
We can look at it the other way.
We
too.
can twist this so that it works for our pockets.
Yeah.
I didn't
And
know
that's
that.
basically that's what slavery comes down to. Like, we can twist our morals and
Hey, luister! Next question. You will
Okay.
Very nice.
second question is,
How did it end? In it.
so the second question is, when and why did the transatlantic slave trade end? And I believe Ola did some research on that.
I did, and it was a very difficult thing to end slavery because it made a lot of money for a lot of people. So there were not many people who were willing to end slavery because they had
Makes sense.
free money, free stuff, free everything. But there were some people who thought it wasn't right, and they actually switched sides with the Bible. They thought this is not good. If we look at Christianity in general, so around 1800, they stopped. There were some people who were trying to stop slavery, but they did it behind the scenes because the public's opinion was still that slaves were good for the economy and for them. So some people behind the scenes said, "Hey, man, you need to quit slavery,
Yeah.
man."
Yeah,
I mean, were slaves not good for the economy though? Because I
Well,
mean,
they definitely were, but a part of the reason why slavery ended is because they started earning less money from the slave trade.
yeah,
Because, for example, in America, a lot of slaves had good enough living conditions to reproduce themselves, which is why now now in America you've got such a large population of African Americans, even though only 5% of the Dutch slaves went to America. And so we didn't keep on selling to America anymore. Brazil also started getting rid of slavery, which was another main supplier, well, buyer. And we also ended up, we stopped selling slaves in 1816, 1813, something like that. And slavery here was abolished in 1863.
Well,
Okay,
I mean,
so-
yeah, at the start it generated a lot of wealth, obviously, slavery, but because of the brutal human trafficking and the results of so many deaths, there was like a rise in opposition against the trade, which caused there to be an abolishment of the law in 1807 in Britain, and also in the 1820s, other countries such as France, Spain, and Holland and Sweden also abolished the law and made even a law against slave trading.
But I think it's not even. It's still really hard because I think one of the reasons for the Civil War of America is the end of slavery. Some people don't want to end it, and some
Yeah,
people.
the
want
South
it.
wanted to keep slavery.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really hard to end it and eventually lead to.
So it's
Yeah,
a
because-
very large topic in history.
yeah, I mean, if you look at it like with England, the British Empire banned the slave trade in 1807, but all the colonies still had slaves because slavery was still fine
think-
as long as you didn't trade slaves from
Yeah.
Africa to the colonies, which still happened illegally. And when like British naval ships would intercept these illegal trading vessels, they would like free the slaves and then end up having to pay whichever country this boat belonged to a ton of money because they wanted to keep the diplomatic relations between the British Empire and, let's say, the Portuguese or the Dutch Empire friendly.
So sort of as a conclusion, the abolishment of slavery is really hard to carry out. And
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's still happening today.
It took
Yeah.
so long because, like Jesse said, only in 1833 were enslaved people being freed in for example, Britain. So
Yeah.
took a
So
while.
then the third question is, what are the effects of the transatlantic slave trade on the society of the time? And I think Batu did some research on that.
yes, like I said, at the start it generated a lot of wealth, but because of the opposition being there against the trading of slaves, it kind of started disappearing step by step with all the new laws. But there was the companies and the individuals that gained wealth still had a lot of power after that too, which made it really hard to make an end to it. And throughout the years, much of West Africa, for example, and also other places where slaves were being worked, had a lot of casualties. They got so underfed, and it was really.
I have a
so
question for
just-
you. Do you know? It's a question for myself. What happened to the slaves when slavery ended? Did they remain at the slave?
Yeah, because they really don't have many places to go.
Yeah, did they remain on the cotton fields and suddenly earn money, or did they leave and start their own life somewhere else? Do you know?
Well, I mean, the ones that got freed got an opportunity at a like equal life.
Yeah.
Sort of. I mean, obviously, only after a certain age, so it's really not equal at all. But at least it's much better of an opportunity than being a slave. But yeah, it was very tough for them because they had to not only fit into society by learning communicating, because they were treated like animals before. They also had to know what wealth is and have to start earning money themselves. So they ended up, for example, working for companies that made boats to explore the Middle East, for example. Obviously not for slavery anymore because that wasn't allowed. But they usually worked in the craftsmanship industry, and yeah, that's pretty much how they started
Interesting.
earning.
Yeah, basically just construction and farming then.
Yeah, I
Exactly,
mean, if you look at what happened with a lot of the British Empire slaves, they were set free from slavery, but they had to do a 4-year apprenticeship before they were officially freed. So basically, they worked their entire lives maybe as slaves, and then slavery is abolished, and then they have to work another 4 years for free, because a lot of apprenticeships back then were free work. So they could get the required skills to go and do something with their lives.
Yeah, but I imagine the people who held the apprenticeship, like the master craftsmen or whatever, I imagine they kept a roof over the ex-slave's head and fed them.
I mean, I would imagine that, but let's face it, it didn't really. The abolishment of slavery didn't exactly change the way
People treated
the majority of the white
Yeah.
society
treated the black
treated
people.
the black society, and it's even, you can see it until today.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Even in today's world, we suffer the consequences of slavery.
Yeah, and
Do you guys remember the crazy rule in the slavery booklet
No.
about what you can do if you kill a slave? What happened then? You guys remember?
No, I don't know. Can you tell me about that?
I believe there isn't many consequences of what killing.
There was a consequence. You couldn't kill a slave, but there was something which
Well, I mean, if it was your slave, you probably could kill it.
yeah,
That's your
there was-
power.
because slaves were seen as property. They weren't someone, they were something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you're
it's like,
But actually,
you can kill your own cow, just don't kill your neighbor's cow, because then you're gonna get in trouble.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
it. Indeed.
So then the fourth question is, how has the transatlantic slave trade affected modern society?
Well, after slavery ended, many slaves went and grouped up together because they had little to no rights at the time. They were left alone because they were brought to a whole new country where they knew no one except their fellow companions who were shipped with them. This led to them grouping up together, and you can still see that in the society today. Like, many people with a different skin color group up in ghettos and other less developed areas. These people tend to commit more crimes because they are like
Because they have less
There's-
opportunity.
Maybe
less opportunities.
Segregation.
In
Yeah,
a
pretty
sense,
much.
it's not like they don't want to mingle. It's just it's
They
been
can't.
that way. It's like hard to remove yourself from the group because you've been grown up in the same community.
It's everything you're used to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
It's a
You've got-
safe
It feels like
environment.
normal. It feels like home. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got all these mannerisms that fit with this micro society, really, and this micro culture of people who look like you, talk like you, and then if you want to go outside, then you're the outcast. You're different. You look, talk, act differently, and what's different scares people.
Right, and another point we can talk about is how some companies in some developing countries use or treat people like slaves. What do you guys think about that?
No, I mean, yeah, like so-called modern slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're talking about? Modern
Yeah.
day slavery? All right.
I mean, that's I think everyone is familiar with that. And basically, people were told, "Hey, here's a job opportunity," and only after they got to there, they were told, "You have to do this, to do that," and only to get a little salary or little.
Yeah, there are a few examples. You have the sex industry, but nearby there's the Flora Holland, the flower Aalsmeer thing. I have Polish family, and there's a village over there, and big guys come with huge cars, a lot of money. They come there. They say, "You come with me, Ding Chen.
Yeah.
You do not have any papers. You keep them here, so you have no rights because you have no papers. You can't go
So
to the cops.
you haven't signed any
No
official
contract,
contract or
nothing.
something.
You're mine now. We go there. You work for your family. You come back. You buy the biggest villa of the whole village.
Yeah.
That's an
Let's do that.
interesting
Come,
It's a
come to
lie,
Holland.
it's a lie.
Come to Holland. You come here. You live in a place that's 2 by 2 meters
Mhm.
with 4 guys in the same room.
What the fuck? No.
No, really.
No way, really.
And you work from
Day to
before
night,
before the sun's up till after the sun's down. More than 12 hours, but you can't go nowhere
Yeah,
because
some
you have
cities
no
really
rights.
hard to imagine
This is
like
at
now.
Flora Holland.
This at Flora Holland.
Wait, that's an interesting difference compared to slavery in the past, because in the past people were kidnapped from their home country, but now
Well,
people
they,
are
well,
now
homeless.
they're
not,
just lied
in
to.
a
I mean-
sense they weren't actually.
Now they're tricked
Because
into.
they were sold by their kings.
The-
The
I
king
mean-
just said, "Hey, I'm sorry, mate. We're selling you now."
But like,
Well, no, it
they were
wasn't
taken
like
away
that.
by
It was-
force, right?
If you're
Yeah,
like
if
fucking
what it
beautiful
would have
girl,
been,
you
it
would
would
get-
have been like rival tribes
Exactly,
who went
yeah.
into battle, and then whoever lost the battle obviously didn't have many fighters left, so they would
Yeah.
just take what was left.
Yeah, exactly.
And the winners
warlords.
would take what was left, and then they would that would be their property.
The
Guns.
slaves themselves were taken away by force, but now slaves are promised, modern slaves are promised more income, more
Yeah, they're
benefits.
tricked. Hey, it was, hey,
Hey, at least it wasn't a
Hey,
shame.
bro, you tweeted
Hey, I
out.
haven't seen a picture.
nah,
I
bro.
can't-
India
I can't-
cows are more expensive than women. So.
So then the fifth question was, what was the Netherlands' role in the transatlantic slave trade?
So basically, this Dutch slave trade started with a Spanish king talking to 2 lonely Dutch merchants from the south of the Netherlands, and he had convinced them to sign a contract, meaning that the Dutch merchants would have to transport 4,000 slaves over the next 4 years to, I believe it was Curacao at the time, but maybe it could have just been back to Spain. Because the WIC started trading slaves in 1630 after they had convinced the country that it was all right.
It was probably Curacao, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, because Curacao was at least in 1650 was the biggest slave depot, and the majority of the slaves stayed in Curacao. 48%, 41% went to Brazil, 5% went to the United States, and the other percent miscellaneous. But the Dutch involvement with the slave trade did come to an end in around about 1813 or so, and that had to do with the fact that they weren't making as much money off of it since Brazil started paying less for slaves. America didn't want to buy slaves anymore, and Curaçao also had a lot of slaves there. So the market had just declined by that point.
And you said something about 5% that the Dutch only.
Yeah, but I'm not entirely certain about that because it was the data on slavery is very weird.
yeah.
It's not the same everywhere you look. But I read that during the entire transatlantic slave trade, the Dutch were only responsible for shipping over 5% of slaves to Curaçao and Brazil and America. But another reason why the trade declined in America, at least, is because compared to Brazil and just compared to Brazil and countries around Brazil, the people in the United States, the slaves in the United States, had much better living conditions, meaning that they had time to reproduce and produce little slave babies, meaning that they didn't have to buy as many slaves.
Okay.
Because the living conditions in Brazil were so bad that on average they died at age 23, and they'd have when they were harvesting sugarcane, at least, because sugarcane goes sour after a day of just having it stored there. So during harvesting season, the slaves were forced to work 48-hour shifts walking with dangerous machineries that would sometimes your hand would get caught in it, and luckily this your masters kept a hatchet on hand so they could chop off hands that get caught in the machines.
Well, that's useful.
Yeah,
So that's basically the reason why
What an invention.
that's basically the reasons why slavery in Brazil was like this. The trade there went on for longer than America, but after some time they got rid of slavery.
Actually, slavery is just sick, isn't it?
It's pretty sick.
When picking slaves,
No, not sick. Like it's cool, you know.
they would
but-
always pick
Pretty
the
rad.
younger ones though, right? That were about to start a family, because they always left the young people, like the young children,
Well-
and the mothers and the old people
Yeah.
behind. And they
on
they
slave
always use
markets,
the-
they always choose the young men who could reproduce.
Yes,
because
but
that
right,
would
right.
be a slave basically for free.
ones
Yeah.
that were about to start a family. Yeah.
But there are also many different types of like levels and stages of quality of slaves, because most slaves were sold in groups for around $100 a head. They said head instead of people because they
Yeah.
treated them like cattle. $100 a head, which is in today's prices, it's $6,000 or so.
That's pretty expensive.
It is pretty expensive, but if you think about it,
If you think about the profit you're gonna make on that one
Yeah.
slave, then
then yeah. And more expensive. Well, slaves that had done blacksmithing or were proper warriors or just like really strong or very beautiful women were sold for more money
okay.
individually.
And do you think that's maybe why they? I mean, why didn't they just take the natives from America and enslave them?
I think I said that before. The disease or the virus or the bacteria, the European brought with them, because they've lived in Europe for like, I don't know, thousands of years. They're already immune to the disease. But when they got to America, the native people, they didn't live in Europe, and they don't have the immunity for those diseases or bacteria.
Yeah,
So
for the
they just-
European diseases.
So they just die off,
And I also think the government would rather see other people work for them rather than their own country.
Yeah.
Rather
I think-
enslave
and
their
it's
own.
even the slave
but
holders.
I mean, the native, like, if we take the example of the Native Americans, right?
Yeah, the so-called
They-
Red Indians.
Yeah. They were. I mean, they were native to the country, but they weren't in charge of the country anymore after European colonization.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I imagine that they weren't brought into slavery as much simply because you then have to capture them and somehow keep them there without them getting freed by their fellow brethren. And it was obviously
Yeah.
just much easier to buy them from
Yeah,
Africa.
and I mean,
Yeah.
Native Americans were also a bit, like, they were a bit smaller built as well compared to Africans, who are in general quite tall.
Yeah,
And,
because they were so civilized compared to like Africa.
well, they weren't exactly more civilized. They were just.
Genetically
Where-
stronger.
Now we got into it.
But
Klopt het?
isn't there a link with Christianity again?
Wasn't that a reason
Because
why they use slaves from Africa and not?
Yeah, that
It's
basically the Africans were more immune to certain diseases.
Genetically stronger.
No,
Yeah, they
not
are.
genetic.
No, that's true.
I mean, yes, because
That's
they
what
were.
you call
They
it.
are taller. They are strong.
They are more
Yeah.
resistant to the sun because
They-
of their skin
yeah.
color. But that's skin
They are
color, not
simply
necessarily.
we need.
I think we're finished with the fifth topic.
Yeah. So basically, the sixth topic was what was the British Empire's involvement in the slave trade, and it's quite simple. Really, they were. Yeah, they were pretty bad. To start off with, they in 1640 they saw that okay, the Dutch and the Portuguese were all they were using slaves on their plantations, on their sugarcane plantations to like basically have free labor. And the English were like, okay, we need to keep up with our market competition because otherwise we're gonna go down, and the Great British Empire isn't gonna be that great anymore. So that's when the first slaves were, or the first British slaves came about, and they were sent to Barbados. And they saw that, wow, okay, it really works, because with slaves you don't have to pay people like the convicts of the British Empire were usually employed and given a salary and looked after, basically. Whereas now you can use slaves, you've got all this money left over, you can buy the land up around you, and you can monopolize an entire island with just sugarcane. And that's what they did. They saw it worked, so they passed a bunch of laws that would label slaves as property, so that it would be easier to deal them and sort of, yeah, encourage good behavior among them by treating them horribly, because yeah, they're just property, they're not people. And then eventually that caught on through the rest of the colonies as well, and in about 150 years later, in 1807, I believe it was, the slave trade was banned in the British colonies. And after that, it was also sort of frowned upon to have a slave on British ground.
Yeah, when did they abolish slavery then?
They only
In Britain.
abolished it.
1807.
No,
that
they
was
stopped
the slave
trading
trade.
slaves.
See, that's
slavery,
where
That's where it gets really sick.
that's where it gets really funny, because the slave trade was abolished in
but they still own
1807.
slaves.
But you were still allowed
Yeah.
to own slaves
Yeah, exactly.
until about 1834 through
33,
to
34,
38.
yeah,
I think the
something
official
like that.
law was passed in 34, and then because of the
much
4-year
better than
apprenticeship, it was 34 or 38. Sorry. But yeah, between those years, between 1807 and 1834, it was pretty much frowned upon to have a slave in England. So on the island of England itself, it wasn't really respectable to have a slave, but in all the other in the colonies, it was perfectly fine, and they kept doing that until it was fully abolished.
And
I mean,
since 1807, the prices of young slaves went up because you could go like this around the regulations.
Yep.
And if you buy a young slave, a young female slave, you could make a new slave without actually trading one from.
Yeah, exactly. Without having to go
Yeah.
buy one in Africa, shipping it all the way to America or one of the other colonies throughout the world.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
If you think about it right now, isn't it?
Yeah, creating your
It's
own
messed up.
army.
Oh my God.
almost.
But
then
what
for
would
slavery.
what would have happened to the world if slavery wasn't there?
Well, the Netherlands wouldn't be as rich. Britain
Alright.
neither. I think the world might just be a bit more balanced.
Yeah.
If slavery
Because
hasn't
it's
happened
really
at all.
Europe and America that profited off of this.
Or if it would have never been.
Not at this scale.
So do you mean if the law against slavery was never
No, like
created,
slavery.
or if slavery had never existed?
Hey,
Yeah,
slavery's been around like since the start of time.
I
Since
know,
we
but-
started.
but if we talk
From
about
the first civilization,
if we
there
talk
was
about
slavery.
this slavery line, the transatlantic,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if that would not have happened.
So if people haven't discovered the routes from
No, it's just like
from
Indeed,
Europe to
but-
Africa to
I mean, they would have discovered, but they wouldn't have made it for slavery. They wouldn't have used
Actually,
it
it
for
doesn't really
slavery.
make
Well,
sense.
it's never
If you
made for
discover that,
slavery.
and at a time, I mean, in that situation, the slavery is like a certain things to happen.
I mean, to be fair, like the trade routes, they already existed. They were there for spices and for.
Yeah, exactly.
But when the slave trade kicked in, it was used a lot more for that. It was more of a one-way
Yes.
stream kind of thing. From like Europe to Africa to America, back to Europe again, to like have a nice even flow of all the produce. But it's pretty difficult to imagine a world where slavery wasn't abolished. Because, yeah.
I don't know, maybe
I wonder if the world wars would have happened.
maybe America
Yeah,
wouldn't be
that's a good
so
question.
developed since no one is going to go there.
Yeah, because the end of slavery was brought about by the start of industrialization.
Oh, good. Oh yeah,
You know, so
that's right.
because that really pushed it to be like, okay, we don't need slaves anymore because we can
Just
process
measure
stuff a lot quicker and very cheaply.
Mhm.
Right.
So I think we've answered all the questions
Was
that
that
we
all of
had.
them?
Yeah.
Alright, let's
That
wrap
was
this up.
talking.
Okay, so I think we've covered all the questions that we had, and that was pretty much a lot of our research as well for the little short film that we're making as well. So we're now gonna give you a little teaser trailer of what happens there.
A little sneak peek.
Little peeky peek.
We've been working on this field the whole day. When do you reckon Mr. Kidd will give us this break?
I don't see it happening too soon. We've all been working far too long, but I don't stop Mr. Billy. It's a real tough one.
But why is Captain Bill so hard on us? We ain't done nothing wrong. Oh, Hank was forced here from a family and sold to men on boats and board here. I only ever do what's good for Mr. Billy and Mr. Stan. They ain't even told me happy birthday last week.
Oh, what are you two good for nothings doing? I ought to hang y'all up and teach y'all a lesson.
Oh.
Deze shit was dun, hè.
Alright, boys.
Nee, maar jij hebt die wel.
Lay them blues there, boy, play. Down in the jail on my knees, I'm down in jail on my knees, down in jail on my knees, and I ain't going to be treated this way. They feed me on cornbread and cheese, they feed me on cornbread and cheese, they feed me on cornbread and cheese, and I ain't going to be treated this way. Let's go to town, boys. Hey, buddy. Lord, Lord, Lord. $10 shoe fits my feet. A $10 shoe fits my feet. $10 shoe fits my feet, and I ain't going to be treated this way. Going where the weather suits my clothes. I'm going where the weather suits my clothes. I'm going where the weather suits my clothes, and I ain't going to be treated this way. Ole, 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 le, ali, ole, le, ali, ole, 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 ay, turn down, boy, turn down. Hey, hey, hey.